The beginning of this peculiar tale occurred on one of those bright, crisp autumn afternoons when the leaves had turned to shades of amber, red, and gold. The townsfolk were busy preparing for the annual fall festival, a celebration that included apple pie competitions, pumpkin carving, and even a small parade. Among the locals buzzing around the center of town was Ethan, a 19-year-old who had made a reputation for himself as the town's mischievous dreamer. Ethan was known for his carefree demeanor, a wide, infectious smile, and a knack for getting into trouble, albeit the harmless kind. He was tall and lanky, his blonde hair always slightly disheveled, and his jeans almost always a bit frayed. Life hadn't been easy for Ethan. His parents had divorced when he was young, and his mother worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, leaving him to his own devices most of the time. While some people in town saw Ethan as a lost cause, others saw potential, a young man waiting to find his way. He had tried community college for a semester, but the lectures bored him, and soon he was back to working odd jobs around town. That's how he met Margaret. Margaret Whitmore was a woman who commanded attention wherever she went. At 65, she was unlike anyone Ethan had ever met. She wasn't frail or soft-spoken like the other elderly women in Maple Creek. She was striking, with platinum blonde hair always styled perfectly, nails painted a deep crimson, and a wardrobe that made people turn their heads. Margaret wore clothes that seemed more appropriate for someone half her age: tight skirts, low-cut blouses, stiletto heels, and yet she carried herself with such authority that no one dared to question her choices. Margaret had moved to Maple Creek almost a decade ago, buying the old Victorian mansion at the edge of town. The mansion was an imposing structure with its tall, narrow windows, wrought iron gates, and a sprawling garden that seemed to be perpetually overgrown. Rumors surrounded the mansion. Some said it was haunted. Others whispered about Margaret's wealth, how she had married an oil tycoon who had mysteriously died, leaving her everything. But no one knew for sure, and Margaret never offered any answers. She kept to herself mostly, and that only added to her mystique. Ethan first met Margaret when he was hired to deliver firewood to the mansion. He had heard the stories about her, of course, and when he saw her standing in the doorway, dressed in a long black gown with pearls around her neck, he felt a mix of intimidation and fascination. Margaret looked at him with eyes that seemed to see right through him, and for a moment, Ethan felt like a child caught in a lie. But then she smiled, a slow, almost predatory smile, and invited him in for tea. It was during that first encounter that Margaret captivated Ethan. She spoke of places he had only dreamed of: Paris, New York, the Mediterranean Sea. She told him stories of parties with artists and musicians, of love affairs and heartbreak, and of fortunes made and lost. Her voice was smooth, her gestures graceful, and Ethan found himself hanging on her every word. No one had ever made him feel so important, so worldly. He returned to the mansion again and again, each time under the pretense of delivering something: firewood, groceries, even a new television set. And each time, Margaret would invite him in, offer him tea or wine, and regale him with stories of her past. Their relationship took a turn one evening, when Margaret invited Ethan to stay for dinner. The dining room was grand, with a chandelier that hung low over the table, casting a golden glow over the silverware and fine china. Margaret wore a deep red dress, her lips painted to match, and Ethan couldn't help but feel like he was in a scene from an old movie. As the night went on, Margaret leaned closer, her hand brushing against his, her gaze lingering. Ethan, caught up in the moment, found himself drawn to her in a way he couldn't quite explain. She was unlike any girl his age. She was confident, experienced, and she made him feel alive. The news of their relationship spread like wildfire. Maple Creek was scandalized. There were whispers in the grocery store, murmurs at church, and outright gasps when people saw Ethan and Margaret together in public. Ethan's mother was beside herself, begging him to reconsider, telling him that Margaret was dangerous, that she was using him. But Ethan wouldn't hear it. He was in love, or at least he thought he was. Margaret had a way of making him feel special, like he was the only person who mattered. And then, just a few months after they had started seeing each other, Margaret proposed. It wasn't a question, really. It was more of a statement. They were having dinner, and she looked at him across the table, her eyes sharp and expectant. "We should get married," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan, caught off guard, nodded. It wasn't the romantic proposal he had imagined, but Margaret had a way of making him believe that it was what he wanted. The wedding was a small affair, held at the mansion. Margaret wore a lace dress that clung to her figure, her hair pinned up in an elaborate style. Ethan wore a suit that Margaret had bought for him, and though he smiled for the pictures, there was a tightness in his eyes, a nervousness that no one seemed to notice. The guests were few. Margaret had no family, and Ethan's friends had mostly distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the whole situation. His mother was there, though she sat in the back, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line. After the ceremony, Margaret and Ethan moved into the mansion together, and it was then that the fairy tale began to unravel. Margaret, who had once seemed so exciting and mysterious, now seemed overbearing. She wanted to know where Ethan was at all times, who he spoke to, what he was thinking. She began to dictate how he dressed, what he ate, even how he spoke. The free-spirited Ethan, who had once roamed the town with his friends, was now confined to the mansion, his every move monitored. The staff, who had once treated Ethan with deference, now looked at him with pity. Margaret's control over him was absolute, and Ethan began to feel like a prisoner in his own home. He tried to push back, to assert himself, but Margaret was relentless. She would remind him of all she had done for him, how she had saved him from a meaningless life, how he owed her everything. And when that didn't work, she would turn cold, her eyes narrowing, her voice cutting. Ethan learned quickly that there was no winning with Margaret. It wasn't long before Ethan began to feel the weight of his choices. He had given up his freedom, his friends, his family, for a woman who seemed more interested in controlling him than loving him. He felt trapped, isolated, and increasingly desperate. The mansion, which had once seemed so grand and full of possibilities, now felt like a prison, a place where he was watched, controlled, and slowly losing himself. After the wedding, life inside the mansion quickly lost its allure. Ethan, who had once felt like the luckiest man in the world to be by Margaret's side, now felt like a butterfly pinned to a board, admired, controlled, and utterly incapable of escape. The Victorian mansion, with its vast, darkened rooms, high ceilings, and labyrinthine halls, no longer seemed grand and romantic. The heavy velvet drapes seemed to block out any hint of sunlight, and the echoes of his own footsteps served as reminders of the emptiness that had taken over his life. Margaret began to change, or perhaps it was Ethan who had changed. Either way, the woman who had once been full of fascinating stories and who had lavished affection on him now appeared to be someone different altogether. The subtle hints of her possessiveness and manipulative tendencies began to evolve into a sinister need for total control. It started with the little things, his clothes, for instance. She would choose his outfits each morning, laying them out on the bed and making snide comments if he chose otherwise. Margaret's demeanor seemed to shift like the wind. There were moments when she would treat Ethan like a beloved pet, pampering him with gifts and doting on him, and other times when she seemed cold and detached, her eyes narrowing as she watched his every move. Ethan never knew which version of Margaret he would get, and that constant uncertainty kept him on edge. He tried to talk to her about it once. He had been pacing in his room, his mind swirling with frustration, and finally, he decided to confront her. He found Margaret in the sitting room, reclining on a chaise lounge with a glass of red wine. Ethan approached her cautiously, and as he started to speak, He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "Margaret, we need to talk," he began, his voice shaking slightly. She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. "About what, darling?" she asked, her tone syrupy sweet. Ethan took a deep breath. "About us. About how things have been lately. I just feel like I need a bit more space." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Margaret set her wine glass down with deliberate slowness, her eyes locked onto his. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but laced with an icy edge. "Space?" she repeated, as if tasting the word. "After everything I've done for you, you think you need space?" Ethan tried to explain, to make her understand that he felt trapped, that he needed to see his friends, to have some freedom. But as he spoke, he could see the change in her eyes, a darkening, a kind of distant rage. She stood up, her posture rigid, and approached him, her fingers digging into his arm. "You ungrateful child," she hissed. "I took you in when you had nothing. I made you into something, and this is how you repay me." Ethan tried to pull away, but her grip was ironclad. "Margaret, please, Enough!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You will do as I say, or you will have nothing. Do you understand me?" Ethan, feeling the sting of her nails pressing into his skin, nodded, the fight draining out of him. He realized then that any attempt to reason with her would be futile. Margaret wasn't interested in love. She was interested in ownership. The weeks that followed were a blur of suffocating routines and stifled attempts at freedom. Margaret installed security cameras around the mansion, telling Ethan they were for protection. She hired a security team, 2 burly men who were always around, watching, lingering in the background. Ethan began to feel their presence, like a weight on his shoulders. Wherever he went, they followed, ensuring he never strayed too far. Ethan's only solace came in the quiet moments when Margaret was away, usually attending her social clubs or town meetings. During these times, he would sit in the library, staring at the rows of books he no longer had the energy to read. He felt hollow, like a ghost haunting a mansion that wasn't his. He missed his friends, his old life, the freedom he once had. He thought of his mother, of her warnings, and how he had ignored them all. Regret gnawed at him, and the mansion, once a symbol of excitement and grandeur, now felt like a tomb. One day, as Ethan was dusting the shelves in the library, a task Margaret had assigned him to keep him busy, he noticed something peculiar. A book on one of the upper shelves seemed slightly out of place, its spine not quite aligned with the others. He pulled it out, revealing a hidden compartment in the back of the shelf. Inside, there were documents, papers that seemed to detail Margaret's past, her financial dealings, and her late husband's will. Ethan's heart raced as he skimmed through the documents, his eyes widening at what he found. Margaret had a history of questionable relationships. Her late husband's death, which had always been shrouded in mystery, now seemed less like an accident and more like something else, something darker. There were mentions of disputes over money, letters from lawyers, and even a police report that had been buried. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the kind of person he was dealing with. Margaret wasn't just controlling, she was dangerous. He knew he had to leave. He had to get out before it was too late. But the mansion was a fortress, and Margaret had eyes everywhere. He began to formulate a plan, a way to escape when Margaret was away, a way to get past the security guards and out into the world where he could be free. He started to hide small amounts of cash, taking whatever he could find in the mansion and stashing it in a hollowed-out section of the floorboard in his room. He tried to keep his behavior normal, to avoid drawing attention, but the weight of what he was planning seemed to grow heavier each day. One night, Margaret announced that she would be attending a town meeting, and Ethan knew this was his chance. He waited until she had left, listening for the sound of the front door closing, the click of her heels fading into the distance. He grabbed his small bag, stuffed with cash and a few essentials, and crept down the stairs. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the front door, his hands trembling as he reached for the handle. But as he opened the door, his heart sank. There they were, Margaret's security guards, standing by the gate, their eyes fixed on him. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, shook his head slowly, a mocking smile on his lips. "Going somewhere, kid?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Ethan felt a surge of panic. He turned, trying to make a run for it. But the other guard grabbed him, his grip like a vice. They dragged him back into the house, forcing him into a chair in the sitting room. Ethan struggled, but it was no use. He was outnumbered, overpowered, and terrified. A short while later, the front door opened, and Margaret walked in. She looked at Ethan, her face expressionless, her eyes cold. She approached him slowly, her heels clicking against the wooden floor, and stood in front of him, her hands on her hips. "I leave for one evening, and this is what you do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no anger in her tone, just disappointment, and that made it even more chilling. Ethan tried to explain, to apologize, but Margaret held up her hand, silencing him. She turned to the guards and nodded. "Leave us," she said, her voice commanding. The guards left the room, and Margaret stood there, looking down at Ethan. She reached for a heavy silver candlestick on the mantel, her fingers wrapping around it slowly, almost thoughtfully. Ethan's eyes widened, and he tried to stand, but Margaret pushed him back into the chair. "You were going to leave me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "After everything I've done for you, you were going to run away." Ethan shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "Margaret, please, Before he could finish, Margaret raised the candlestick and brought it down with a sickening thud. Ethan felt a sharp pain, and then everything went dark. When Ethan awoke, his head throbbed with a pain that seemed to reverberate through his entire body. He blinked, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The dim light revealed that he was in the basement. Somewhere in the depths of the mansion he had never been allowed before. His hands were bound tightly with rope, and he could feel the dampness of the cold cement floor beneath him. He tried to move, but the restraints cut into his wrists, and he realized with a growing sense of horror just how precarious the situation had become. Margaret stood a few feet away, her figure cast in shadow. She held a glass of wine in one hand, sipping it calmly as if everything were perfectly normal. Her face was serene, almost pleasant, but her eyes told a different story. They held a dark intensity that chilled Ethan to the bone. She watched him for a moment before speaking, her voice eerily composed. "Do you know what hurts the most, Ethan?" she asked, her gaze fixed on him. "It's not the betrayal, though that's bad enough. It's the ingratitude. I gave you everything. This house, a life most people could only dream of, and you chose to throw it all away." Ethan's head spun, the words she spoke barely registering. He tried to piece together what had happened, to understand why he was here, bound and helpless. He tried to speak, to plead with her, but his throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper. "Margaret, I'm sorry," he managed, his voice cracking. I just wanted my life back." Margaret stared at him for a long moment, and then, without a word, she turned and walked out of the basement, the door closing behind her with a heavy, metallic thud. Ethan listened as the lock clicked into place, and he was plunged into silence and darkness. The hours that followed felt like days. Ethan struggled against his restraints, but the ropes were too tight, and the pain in his head made it difficult to focus. He could feel the panic rising, the fear that he might never leave this place. He thought of his mother, of how she had warned him, of how he had ignored her. He thought of his friends, of the life he had before Margaret, a life that now seemed like a distant memory. He had been foolish, blinded by the allure of something different, something exciting, and now he was paying the price. Margaret returned later, her demeanor unchanged. She brought him food and water, setting it down beside him without a word. She watched as he tried to eat, his hands still bound, his movements awkward and painful. She seemed to take pleasure in his struggle, her lips curling into a faint smile. "You know, Ethan," she said, her voice almost gentle, "I didn't want it to come to this. I wanted us to be happy. I thought you understood what we had, a bond that couldn't be broken. But you've disappointed me." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. "Please, Margaret," he begged, his voice trembling. "Let me go. I won't tell anyone, I promise. Just let me go." Margaret's smile faded, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something. Regret, perhaps, or sadness. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by that cold, calculating gaze. "No, Ethan," she said softly. "You belong to me, and I can't let you leave." Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. Ethan couldn't be sure. Time had lost all meaning in the darkness of the basement. Margaret kept him alive, feeding him just enough to keep him from starving, but the isolation, the confinement, began to wear on him. He felt himself slipping away, his thoughts growing disjointed, his hope dwindling with each passing moment. He could hear Margaret upstairs, her footsteps echoing through the house, the sound of her voice as she spoke to the guards, as if everything were perfectly normal. But one night, something changed. Ethan was roused from a fitful sleep by a noise, a faint, distant sound that seemed out of place. He listened, straining to hear, and realized it was coming from above, voices, raised, urgent. There was a crash, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, and then silence. Ethan's heart raced, a mix of fear and hope surging through him. Something was happening, something that might mean his chance to escape. He heard the basement door creak open, and for a moment his heart sank, expecting to see Margaret's silhouette. But instead, there was a different figure, a woman, her features obscured in the dim light. She moved quickly, her footsteps soft as she approached him. As she knelt beside him, Ethan saw her face, and a wave of relief washed over him. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His mother's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and determination. She reached for the ropes, her hands trembling as she worked to untie them. "Ethan, oh my God," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here. I'm going to get you out of here." It took what felt like an eternity, but finally, the ropes fell away, and Ethan felt the rush of freedom, of blood flowing back into his limbs, of movement. His mother helped him to his feet, her arm around his waist as they made their way to the stairs. Ethan's body felt weak, every step a struggle, but he forced himself to keep moving, the thought of escape the only thing keeping him going. As they reached the top of the stairs, Ethan saw the source of the noise, a broken vase, shards of porcelain scattered across the floor. The front door was open, the cool night air spilling into the house. His mother guided him toward it, her movements quick and frantic. "We have to go now," she said, her voice urgent. They stumbled out of the mansion, into the night. The air was crisp, the stars shining overhead. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. They made their way down the driveway, his mother half carrying him, her strength seeming almost superhuman in that moment. Behind them, the mansion loomed, dark and foreboding, and as they reached the gate, Ethan turned to look back. He saw Margaret standing in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the dim light from inside. She didn't move, didn't call after them. She just watched, her expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, and Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. There was no rage in her gaze, no anger, just a cold, detached emptiness. And then they were through the gate, and his mother was leading him away, down the road, away from the mansion, away from Margaret. Ethan didn't look back again. The aftermath of Ethan's escape was a blur of police reports, hospital visits, and questions, so many questions. Margaret was taken into custody, but the charges were complicated. She had connections, resources, and her lawyers painted a picture of a woman who had been wronged, who had only been trying to help a troubled young man. The trial became a spectacle. The townspeople divided, some seeing Margaret as a monster, others as a misunderstood widow. Ethan, meanwhile, struggled to piece his life back together. The trauma of what he had endured lingered, the memories of the basement, of Margaret's cold gaze, haunting him. He moved back in with his mother, trying to regain some sense of normalcy, but nothing felt the same. He had been broken, and the process of healing seemed impossible at times. One day, months after his escape, Ethan received a letter. There was no return address, but he knew who it was from before he even opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with a short, handwritten note. "You can never truly leave me." Ethan's hands trembled as he read the words, the familiar handwriting sending a chill through him. He crumpled the letter, his breath coming in short gasps. He looked around, the walls of his room suddenly feeling too close, the air too thick. Margaret might have been gone, but her shadow still loomed over him. The fear, the control, the sense of being watched. It was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind. He realized with a sinking feeling that escape wasn't just about leaving the mansion. It was about breaking free of her hold on him, the hold she still seemed to have, even from afar. And that was the hardest part. Finding a way to be free, truly free from Margaret, from the nightmare she had created. It was a journey he knew would take time, perhaps years. But as he looked out the window, at the world beyond, he felt a small glimmer of hope. He had survived, and that meant something. It meant there was still a chance for him, still a chance to reclaim his life, piece by piece.